Lars Bergman woke in absolute comfort while 3 miles away. Henrik Lund fired 3 desperate shots into the frozen dawn, the universal signal that a trapper was freezing to death in his own cabin. The temperature outside both structures was 30 below zero. Before we begin, let us know where you're watching from, and if stories like this move you, hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's episode is even more unbelievable than this one. The fire in the cabin had burned down to embers sometime around 3 in the morning. Lars Bergman woke first, his breath visible in the frigid air, his body shaking so violently that his teeth chattered. The interior temperature had dropped so fast that frost had formed on the iron kettle hanging near the hearth. He stumbled from his sleeping platform and fed the fire. Hands numb, fingers barely able to grip the split logs he kept stacked beside the stone fireplace. It was January 1839 in the Rocky Mountains, 40 miles west of what would someday become the Wyoming border. Lars was 31 years old and had survived 6 winters, trapping beaver along the tributaries that fed into the Green River. He knew cold. He understood how to build fires, how to layer clothing, how to read weather signs and prepare for brutal temperature drops. But knowing cold and surviving it were different things. He turned to wake his partner. Nils Anderson lay on his platform against the opposite wall, completely still under his buffalo robe and wool blankets. Lars called his name. No response. He crossed the small cabin in 3 steps and pulled back the buffalo robe. Nils's face was pale, his lips blue. His eyes were open but unfocused. He was breathing, but the breaths were shallow and irregular. His skin was cold to the touch, far colder than it should have been even in a freezing cabin. Lars worked frantically. He dragged Nils closer to the fire, wrapped him in every blanket they owned, heated stones, and placed them around his body, forced warm liquid between his lips when Nils's consciousness flickered briefly back. For 2 hours, Lars fought to reverse the hypothermia, maintaining the fire at levels that consumed their carefully rationed firewood at an alarming rate. Nils never fully regained consciousness. His breathing grew more irregular as dawn approached. By the time weak sunlight filtered through the single small window, Nils Anderson was dead. He was 27 years old. He had survived storms, grisly encounters, dangerous river crossings, and countless other wilderness hazards over 4 years in the mountains. He died in his sleep in his own cabin because the fire went out and the temperature dropped too fast. Lars sat beside his partner's body as full morning arrived. The cabin had warmed considerably with the aggressive fire he had maintained, but he knew that tonight, when the fire inevitably burned low again, he would face the same deadly temperature drop. The cabin they had, built the previous summer, was typical of frontier construction. Log walls with mud chinking, a simple bark and pole roof, 1 door, 1 window. It had seemed adequate when they built it. Now, Lars understood it was barely better than sleeping outside. Lars buried Nils on a hillside overlooking the creek where they had run their most productive trap lines. The ground was frozen solid. It took him most of a day to break through the surface using a pickaxe and iron bar, creating a shallow grave in the rocky soil. He wrapped Nils in the buffalo robe that had failed to keep him warm and piled stones over the burial site to protect it from scavengers. He spoke no words over the grave. Nils had been Norwegian, nominally Lutheran, but neither man had been religious in any practical sense. What mattered was that Nils had been a competent partner, an honest man, and someone Lars had trusted in country where trust meant survival. Now he was dead from something as simple and stupid as a fire, burning out during the night. Lars spent the next 3 days in the cabin, continuing to run the trap lines mechanically, but spending his evenings staring at the structure around him with growing comprehension of its inadequacy. The walls were solid enough, thick logs notched at the corners and chinked with moss and mud. But the roof was the problem. It consisted of thin poles laid across the top wall logs, covered with bark strips and a layer of sod. The construction was standard for mountain cabins, quick to build and serviceable for basic shelter. But it was also fundamentally flawed for extreme cold. Heat rose. Every trapper knew this. You built your sleeping platform high because warm air collected near the ceiling. But in a cabin with a thin roof, that rising heat simply escaped through the minimal barrier of poles, bark, and dirt. The roof provided almost no insulation, no thermal mass, no way to retain the warmth generated by the fire. Lars had never thought about thermal mass before. He barely had words for the concept, but he understood it now in practical terms. The stone fireplace held heat longer than the wooden walls. Iron kettles stayed warm after being removed from flames. Thick materials absorbed warmth and released it slowly. Thin materials let heat pass through quickly. His roof was as thin as possible while still keeping out rain and snow. That made it cheap and fast to build, but it also made it useless for retaining heat. On a night like the one that killed Nils, when the exterior temperature dropped to 20 or 30 below zero, a cabin with a thin roof became a frozen box within hours of the fire dying. Other trappers accepted this as normal. You kept your fire burning all night, or you woke up cold and relit it. If you ran out of firewood, you froze. If you got sick or injured and couldn't maintain the fire, you died. This was simply how things were. Lars decided it didn't have to be that way. Somewhere between burying his partner and the end of that bitter January, he became obsessed with a single question that would consume the next year of his life. How do you build a cabin roof that holds heat? Spring arrived in late March, bringing the thaw that turned every creek into a rushing torrent and made the high country trap lines accessible again. Lars worked through April and May with mechanical efficiency, harvesting the last valuable pelts of the season. His mind was elsewhere. Every evening in the cabin, he studied the roof structure, trying to understand what would make it better. In early June, he packed his furs and made the 3-week journey to St. Louis. Most trappers arrived in the city with one goal: to sell their pelts for the highest price possible, spend a week drinking and gambling, then return to the mountains. Lars sold his furs to a trading company for a decent price, then did something that made the other mountain men think he had lost his mind. He stayed in St. Louis for 5 weeks and spent his days studying buildings. He started with the oldest structures, thick-walled stone buildings constructed by French settlers decades earlier. He noticed how cool they remained even during hot summer days, how the temperature inside changed slowly despite dramatic swings outside. The walls were 3 feet thick in places, massive amounts of stone that absorbed heat during the day and released it at night, moderating the interior temperature. He visited root cellars dug into hillsides, noting how the earth itself provided insulation. He watched bakers working with brick ovens, seeing how the thick brick walls held heat for hours after the fires died, allowing them to bake multiple batches of bread from a single firing. He observed a blacksmith shop where the forge was surrounded by thick clay and stone, retaining enough heat that the smith could restart his fire the next morning from embers that had survived the night buried in the thermal mass. Lars spent hours at a warehouse construction site, watching carpenters frame a large building. He paid particular attention to how they engineered the roof structure, using heavy timbers to support weight, spacing beams to distribute loads evenly. He asked questions until the foreman grew tired of him, then watched silently from a distance. He visited a bricklayer who was building a chimney for a new hotel. The mason explained how different materials conducted heat at different rates, how thickness mattered, how air gaps could provide insulation. The man had no idea why a mountain trapper cared about these details, but Lars absorbed every word. The insight came during his 4th week in the city. He was watching workers demolish an old building, tearing apart thick log walls that had been part of a fur company warehouse. The logs were massive, 12 to 16 inches in diameter, and even after decades they remained solid and heavy. One of the workers complained about how much the timbers weighed, how they held moisture, heat, how difficult they were to move. Lars realized that weight and thermal mass were connected. Heavy materials, especially thick wood, stored energy. They absorbed heat when warm and released it slowly when cold. A thin roof made of poles and bark had almost no thermal mass. But a roof made of logs, thick logs stacked in layers like a wall, would have enormous thermal mass. Lars returned to the mountains in late July 1839 with supplies that puzzled every trapper who saw them. Instead of the usual coffee, salt, powder, and lead, he had purchased specialized woodworking tools, coils of rope, a set of iron pulleys, and 3 notebooks filled with sketches and calculations he had made in St. Louis. He spent the first week back scouting timber. Not for cabin logs in the conventional sense, but for specific trees that met criteria no other mountain man had ever considered important. He wanted the largest diameter logs possible, perfectly straight, uniform thickness from base to crown, and dense wood that would weigh as much as possible. He rejected hundreds of trees, too much taper, too many branches leaving knots, slight curve in the trunk, irregular bark indicating twisted grain. He marked acceptable trees with his axe, creating a map in his notebooks of where each tree stood and its approximate dimensions. Sven Carlson encountered Lars during this process in mid-August. Sven was a Swedish immigrant who had been trapping the Rockies for 12 years, a hard man who had survived everything the wilderness could offer. He found Lars standing beside a massive pine, measuring its diameter with a length of rope, making notes in his book. "You building a fort, Bergman?" Sven's tone was mocking. "That tree would make 6 normal roof poles." Lars explained his plan, a roof built from logs, not poles. Large logs laid horizontally and stacked in multiple layers, creating massive thickness and weight. The thermal mass would hold heat from the fire and radiate back into the cabin for hours after the flames died. Sven laughed so hard he had to sit down. "You want to build a roof heavier than most men's entire cabins? That will collapse before you finish building it. And even if it doesn't, you will waste a month cutting logs when you could build a normal cabin in 4 days." Lars had expected this reaction. He tried to explain the principle, how mass equaled heat storage, how thickness provided insulation. Sven cut him off. "I have survived 12 winters with normal roofs. Your partner died because he was careless with the fire, not because the roof was wrong. You are wasting time on crazy ideas when you should be preparing your trap lines for fall." Word spread quickly through the scattered trapping community. Eric Holmberg, a Norwegian trader who traveled between camps buying furs and selling supplies, carried the story up and down the Green River drainage. "Mad Bergman is building a cabin with a roof from logs bigger than most men's. Walls. He thinks it will keep him warm without fire. The man has lost his mind from grief." The nickname stuck, Mad Bergman. The fool Swede, though Lars was actually from a Norwegian family that had settled in Minnesota before he went west. Other trappers began placing informal bets on whether his roof would collapse during construction or after the first heavy snow. Lars ignored all of it. By early September, he had identified and marked 62 trees that met his requirements. Each one would become part of his roof. Together, they would create something no mountain man had ever built, and something that would either vindicate his theory or prove everyone right about his madness. Lars began construction in mid-September 1839, starting with a foundation that was already unusual by mountain standards. He dug a shallow trench around the perimeter and filled it with rocks, creating a level base. Most trappers skipped this step entirely, but Lars knew his roof would be extraordinarily heavy and required proper support from the ground up. The wall construction proceeded normally. He cut, hauled, and stacked logs of standard diameter, perhaps 10 inches thick, notching them at the corners in the traditional saddle joint pattern. He chinked gaps with moss and clay. The walls rose steadily through late September and early October. By the first week of November, the walls were complete and the real work began. Neighboring trappers arrived to watch when Lars started on the roof. Gunnar Olofsson rode 8 miles specifically to see what Mad Bergman was actually attempting. A small crowd of 5 trappers gathered as Lars prepared to lift the first roof log into place. The log was a massive pine, 14 inches in diameter and 16 feet long. Lars had rigged a pulley system using the ropes and iron hardware he had purchased in St. Louis, anchoring it to nearby trees. Even with the mechanical advantage, it took him 2 hours of exhausting effort to raise the log and position it across the top of the cabin walls. "That is 1 roof beam," Gunnar observed. "You are building the entire roof from these?" Lars nodded, too tired to speak, and began preparing the second log. "It will collapse," Gunnar said with certainty. "No cabin walls can support that weight. You will be crushed inside your own structure." The other trappers agreed. They debated whether the walls would fail during construction or after the first heavy snow added additional weight. Some argued the roof logs themselves would crack under their own mass. Others suggested the whole thing would simply tip over sideways because the center of gravity would be too high. Lars worked without responding to the commentary. He laid the second log parallel to the first, spacing them 18 inches apart, then a third, then a fourth. The process was brutally physical. Each log had to be cut to precise length, stripped of bark, hauled to the cabin site, and lifted into position using the pulley system. By mid-November, he had completed the first layer of logs spanning the cabin roof. Then he started the second layer, perpendicular to the first. Then a third layer parallel to the first. The roof grew thicker with each addition. After 6 layers, the roof structure was nearly 3 feet thick, composed entirely of massive logs stacked like cordwood. The trappers who watched called it Bergman's Folly. They joked that he had built a prison for himself or a tomb. They calculated that the roof alone weighed more than 3 entire conventional cabins. Sven Karlsson started a betting pool on the day it would collapse. By late November, Lars moved his supplies inside. The roof held. The first snow began falling. The real test was just beginning. December 1839 brought the first serious cold of the winter. Temperatures dropped steadily through the month, reaching 0 degrees by mid-December and staying there for days at a time. The trappers scattered across the up-tent. Green River drainage settled into their winter routines, burning fires constantly, rationing firewood, and enduring the cold that was simply part of mountain life. Lars established a different routine in his new cabin. Each evening, he built a fire for cooking and warmth, letting it burn hot for 3 or 4 hours. The flames heated the interior space and, more importantly, heated the massive log structure above his head. The interior surface of the roof logs grew warm to the touch as they absorbed the thermal energy rising from the fire. Then, around 9 or 10 at night, he would let the fire die down to coals and eventually go out completely. This was the moment that would have been dangerous in a conventional cabin. Heat would escape rapidly through a thin roof, and the interior temperature would plummet within an hour or 2. But Lars's cabin behaved differently. The temperature dropped slowly, almost imperceptibly. He would wake at dawn, 6 or 7 hours after the fire had died, and the cabin would still be comfortable. Not warm exactly, but far from the deadly cold that penetrated conventional structures. He could dress without shaking, make breakfast without numb fingers, and restart his fire at a reasonable pace rather than in desperate urgency. He conducted a simple test one morning. He placed his bare hand flat against the interior ceiling logs. They were warm, not hot, but noticeably warmer than the ambient air in the cabin. The logs had absorbed heat the previous evening and were now radiating it back into the space. The thermal mass he had built into his roof was functioning exactly as he had theorized. Out of curiosity, Lars visited Gunnar Olofsson's cabin one December afternoon. Gunnar's structure was typical frontier construction, built efficiently in 4 days the previous year. Inside, even with a fire burning, the cabin felt drafty and cold. Gunnar kept his fire roaring constantly, consuming alarming amounts of firewood. "How much wood are you burning per day?" Lars asked. Gunnar estimated 20 to 30 pieces of split firewood, burning continuously from evening until morning. Lars was burning perhaps 15 pieces total, concentrated in the evening hours, then letting the fire die completely. His firewood consumption was half of Gunnar's, yet his cabin remained more comfortable. Gunnar attributed this to luck or perhaps thicker walls, though Lars's walls were standard thickness. He refused to believe the roof made any difference. "Heat goes up and out," Gunnar insisted. "That is how it works. Your roof just holds it in slightly longer, but you still need fire to stay warm." Lars didn't argue. The real test would come in January, when the truly brutal cold arrived. December had been mild by Rocky Mountain standards. What happened when temperatures dropped to 20 or 30 below zero would prove whether his theory was correct or whether he had simply built an absurdly heavy roof for minimal benefit. The cold snap hit on January 15, 1840. The temperature plummeted overnight, dropping from 10 above zero to 30 below by dawn. The extreme cold settled over the mountains and stayed there, creating conditions that tested every trapper's preparation and survival skills. Henrik Lund was 23 years old, trapping his second winter in the Rockies. His cabin was located about 5 miles from Lars's location, a standard log structure he had built the previous summer with help from Sven Karlsson. Henrik had stocked adequate firewood and supplies. He understood how to survive cold weather. But he had never experienced 30 below zero. His fire burned steadily through the evening of January 14th. He kept it roaring, feeding split logs regularly, keeping the interior of his small cabin tolerably warm. But firewood consumption at that rate was unsustainable. By midnight, he realized he was burning through his supply far faster than planned. By 1 in the morning, he started rationing, letting the fire burn lower to conserve wood. By 2 in the morning, his firewood was gone. He had miscalculated badly. The cold was so extreme that his consumption rate had tripled compared to normal winter nights. He tried burning his spare wooden equipment, chair, and shelving boards. These burned quickly and provided minimal heat. By 3 in the morning, the fire was dead, and the temperature inside the cabin was dropping rapidly. Henrik made a decision that saved his life. Instead of staying in the cabin and hoping to survive until dawn, he dressed in every layer he owned, grabbed his rifle, and left the cabin. The darkness was absolute, the cold was staggering, but he knew the general direction to Lars's cabin. He fired 3 shots into the air, the universal distress signal, and started walking. The journey took him nearly 90 minutes, stumbling through snow in the dark, following landmarks he could barely see. When he finally saw the dim outline of Lars's cabin against the snow, he was on the edge of hypothermia, his hands and feet numb, his thinking confused. He pounded on the door. Lars answered immediately, wearing only light clothing, the interior of his cabin warm enough that he had been sleeping comfortably under a single blanket. Henrik stumbled inside and collapsed near the fireplace where a small fire burned. The contrast was shocking. Outside was lethal cold. Henrik's cabin had become a frozen box, but Lars's cabin was warm, genuinely warm despite having only a modest fire burning. Lars built up the fire and wrapped Henrik in blankets. As Henrik's body temperature slowly recovered, he kept repeating the same question. "How is your cabin this warm?" "My fire was roaring and I was still freezing." "Yours is barely burning and it feels like summer." Lars pointed at the ceiling. "The logs," he said simply. "They hold the heat and give it back slowly. I burned a good fire last evening. The roof is still releasing that warmth." Henrik stared at the thick log ceiling, understanding dawning despite his exhausted, cold-addled state. Mad Bergman had not been mad at all. The extreme cold lasted 5 days. During that time, every trapper in the region struggled with firewood consumption, frozen supplies, and the constant battle to maintain survivable temperatures inside their cabins. Henrik Lund stayed at Lars's cabin for 2 of those days, recovering from his close call and observing how the thermal roof system functioned. When the temperature finally moderated to 10 below zero, which felt almost warm by comparison, Henrik returned to his own cabin to salvage what he could. Most of his food supplies had frozen solid. His water barrel had split from ice expansion. The cabin itself was undamaged, but it had proven completely inadequate for extreme cold. Word of Henrik's near-death and subsequent rescue spread quickly through the trapping community. More importantly, word spread about the condition of Lars's cabin during the same cold snap. He had been comfortable. He had used half the firewood of other trappers. His supplies had not frozen. The massive roof that everyone had mocked as foolish extravagance had performed exactly as Lars claimed it would. Sven Karlsson was the first to visit, arriving at Lars's cabin in late January with obvious reluctance. He examined the roof structure from outside, noting that it had not collapsed despite supporting its own enormous weight plus heavy snow accumulation. Inside, he placed his hand against the ceiling logs and felt residual warmth even though the fire had been out for hours. "I was wrong," Sven said bluntly. "I do not understand how it works, but it works. How did you know to build this?" Lars explained his observations from Street Lewis. Thick materials holding heat. thermal mass absorbing and releasing energy slowly. The principle was simple once you understood it, but no one had thought to apply it to cabin roofs because conventional wisdom said roofs should be light. Other trappers followed. Gunnar Olafsson came with detailed questions. How thick did the logs need to be? What species of wood worked best? How much weight could standard cabin walls support? Did the spacing between logs matter? Lars answered freely. He shared his calculations for load-bearing, his observations about different wood densities, his techniques for lifting heavy logs into place. He had no interest in keeping secrets. If the technique helped others survive, that was enough. Oscar Bjornsson, a Norwegian trapper with nearly 20 years mountain experience, visited in early February. Oscar was respected throughout the region as one of the most knowledgeable mountain men alive. His endorsement carried weight. He spent 3 hours examining Lars's cabin, asking technical questions, testing the warmth retention himself. "This changes everything," Oscar said finally. "A man could winter in this cabin with 1/3 the firewood of conventional structures. That means less time cutting wood, less risk of running out during extreme cold, less chance of freezing if you get injured or sick. This is not a small improvement. This is the difference between life and death." By late February, 5 trappers had announced plans to build Bergman-style roofs when construction season arrived in spring. The mockery had transformed into genuine interest. Mad Bergman had become simply Bergman, the man who solved the problem no one else had recognized as solvable. Spring of 1840 brought the first wave of construction using Lars's thermal roof principles. Henrik Lund built the first replica, choosing a site near his failed original cabin. He worked through May and June, selecting large-diameter logs with the same obsessive care Lars had demonstrated. His roof used slightly smaller logs, 12-inch diameter instead of 14, but followed the same stacked layer approach. When completed in early July, his cabin had a roof nearly 2 feet thick, composed entirely of horizontal log layers. Oscar Bjornsson built next, applying his 2 decades of wilderness construction experience to refine the technique. He discovered that mixing log species created better thermal performance. Dense hardwoods for the interior layers absorbed and retained heat most effectively. Lighter softwoods for the exterior layers provided better insulation. His hybrid approach became the preferred method for trappers who had access to multiple wood types. Anders Eriksson was not a trapper, but a settler attempting to establish a homestead in the Montana Territory with his wife and 3 children. He heard about the Bergman roof from a traveling trader and decided to incorporate it into his family cabin. The construction took him most of the summer of 1841, working alone and using a modified pulley system to lift the heavy logs. His roof ended up slightly thinner than Lars's original, but still massively overbuilt by conventional standards. The Eriksson family's first winter validated the technique for domestic use. Anders calculated that he burned 60% less firewood than his neighbor who had a conventional cabin. More importantly, his children were never exposed to dangerous cold inside their home. Even when the fire died overnight, the cabin remained warm enough that freezing was never a concern. His wife Sarah wrote letters to relatives back east describing their surprisingly comfortable winter, letters that would eventually influence other settler families moving west. By 1843, an estimated 20 cabins across the northern Rockies incorporated some version of the thermal roof design. The technique had acquired several names. Bergman roof was most common, but some called it the stacked log method or the thermal mass roof. Variations emerged based on available materials and builder skill levels. Some used fewer layers of thicker logs, others used more layers of thinner logs. Some incorporated insulation materials like moss or clay between the log layers. The practical advantages extended beyond warmth. The massive roof structure proved exceptionally durable. Conventional cabin roofs required repair or replacement every 3 to 5 years as bark rotted and poles deteriorated. Bergman roofs lasted decades with minimal maintenance. The thick logs resisted rot, shed water effectively, and supported enormous snow loads without structural stress. Several cabins built in 1840 were still standing and occupied in the 1860s, the heavy log roofs as solid as the day they were constructed. The technique spread geographically as trappers relocated and settlers moved into new territories. By the mid-1840s, variations of the design appeared in Idaho, western Montana, and northern Wyoming. The fur trade was collapsing as beaver populations declined and fashion shifted away from felt hats. But the construction innovation Lars had developed outlived the industry that had brought him to the mountains. Lars Bergman left the mountains in 1844. The fur trade had collapsed completely. Beaver populations were depleted, and silk had replaced felt in hat manufacturing. The economic foundation that had supported mountain men for 2 decades had vanished. Lars was 36 years old with modest savings from his trapping years. He traveled to the Oregon Territory and purchased land in the Willamette Valley, establishing a small farm. He married Ingrid Larsen in 1846, a Norwegian immigrant he met through the Scandinavian community in Salem. They had 4 children and lived quietly. Lars rarely spoke about his mountain years. To his family, he was simply a farmer who had once worked in the fur trade. His children never knew about the cabin he had built or the innovation that had saved lives across the northern Rockies. But the cabins remained. Trappers who had built Bergman roofs abandoned them as the fur trade died, but the structures stood empty and intact. Prospectors during the gold rushes of the 1850s discovered these cabins and recognized their superior construction. Many were reoccupied and maintained. Settlers moving into Montana and Wyoming territories in the 1860s found abandoned thermal roof cabins and claimed them, often living in structures built 20 years earlier that were still more weatherproof than newly constructed conventional cabins. Several documented cases exist of people surviving extreme weather specifically because they occupied thick-roofed cabins. In 1857, a prospector named Thomas Wade survived 3 weeks of severe winter storms in an abandoned cabin near the Green River. His journal explicitly mentioned the unusual heavy log roof that kept the interior warm despite his limited firewood supply. In 1863, a settler family survived an early October blizzard in a cabin they had found abandoned, noting in a letter that the thick roof construction had saved their lives when they ran out of fuel. The technique itself evolved and spread beyond its original context. Homesteaders adapted the principles to barns and root cellars. Army engineers building frontier forts incorporated thermal mass concepts into critical structures. The underlying physics that Lars had discovered through observation and necessity eventually became formalized architectural knowledge, though by then few people remembered the Norwegian mountain man who had first applied it. Lars died in 1872 at age 64, buried in a small cemetery outside Salem. His obituary made no mention of his mountain years or his construction innovations. But in the mountains of Montana and Wyoming, remnants of his legacy remained visible for decades afterward. Historians and archaeologists studying frontier settlement patterns would occasionally encounter cabin ruins with inexplicably massive roof structures, thick logs, stacked in layers far beyond what conventional construction required. What had seemed like pointless waste, using the biggest logs for a roof when conventional wisdom demanded lightweight construction, had proven to be an elegant solution to a deadly problem. Lars Bergman had refused to accept that freezing to death was simply part of mountain life. His answer, built from observation, experimentation, and sheer determination, had transformed an impossible challenge into a solved engineering problem that kept people warm for generations after he left the wilderness behind.